saves it, which is what makes me happy. And vuoi uscire dal sito? Nulla. I just want to, I don't want to have it. I just want to reduce the window so that we can actually, okay, good, that's it. Yay. That's the geography, the book. So I said that the book comes with online resources, what's on Virtuale, everything, all of the readings. And week one, in fact, readings for week 2 will be chapters, I made a mistake here, readings for week. So some of the background readings are chapter 1, the basic questions. And then next week we will do 2 and 3, okay? That's what I meant. So next week you will do chapters 2 and 3, and this week we'll finish chapter 1. Okay, but some of the things that we talked about already concern chapter 2, and I'm following the book and integrating it with other things. Okay, but it's good to have this. It's a reference book for lots of things, so it's good. There's good reasons to have a book. Yeah.
Sorry for this dumb question, but is it like uploaded online? The book?
It is. It's on Virtuale, and it's the PDF. Right, so you can just download it. It's on the. If you go into Virtuale, you should find this.
Pamela, it's here. It's loading, but you can see it.
Yeah, it's there. Okay. And so we talked about this when we said, what's the relationship between language and thought? That's kind of a pretty, somebody had a question about that yesterday. Who was it? Who said, well, when I asked, well, what's language production? And who was it who said the question about does how you speak influence how you think, right? And so it's actually a pretty profound, not just philosophical, scientific, psychological question, what the relationship is between thinking and speaking. There's reasons to think that thinking is not the same thing as speaking. Okay, so for example, although there is a sense in which the moment you encode something linguistically, it has an effect on your memory and how you understand reality. This is true. On the other hand, when you look at people who, for example, who have lost their language because of a stroke, when we talked about aphasia, right? It's not that they can't think anymore. It's now suddenly what was easy, which was to just talk about everyday things, becomes very hard because, for example, you can't find the words, you can't inflect them grammatically, you can't find the verbs, you cannot construct a grammatical sentence anymore, but there's nothing wrong with your thinking. Okay, so the reason why we think that there's this separation between thinking and our language system also comes from studies of people who've had a stroke. Okay, so when we talk about language in this mental sense, we talk about the mental grammar. Okay, this is a jargon that comes from Chomskyan linguistics, although meaning that we're looking at this unique ability that humans have to combine units, phonemes, syllables, words, sentences, open-endedly to say new things. So it's the combinatorial aspect of language that is not shared with other communication systems, right? So animals communicate, we also have different ways that we communicate, but there's something, let's say, special about human language, okay? And this system allows speakers to organize ideas into words and sentences into sequences of sounds when they produce, and to express potentially an open-ended set of thoughts. We talked yesterday about the fact that this is not grammar in the traditional sense. that explicit. It's implicit knowledge. So speakers don't have access to it. They can't. It's like tying your shoes. You can turn it, you can describe it, but in fact, when you put it to use, it is implicit knowledge. Okay, so implicit knowledge is skilled-based knowledge, and for example, it's distinct from explicit knowledge. Like if I ask you what your friend's phone number is, that's explicit knowledge. Okay, so it's knowledge in terms of doing, like riding a bicycle, talking, and so on. And in fact, if you look, for example, at the language of people who have memory impairments, so there are all kinds of memory impairments, including memory impairments that come from dementia. Okay, people with dementia, Alzheimer's, you probably have great-grandparents or grandparents who maybe have memory issues. Up until the very end, their language is actually grammatically intact. Okay, you speak with my father has dementia, and his grammar is perfectly okay. He repeats kind of the same things, but he still has the implicit knowledge of the rules of the language. Okay, he still speaks Italian. So this tacit knowledge that we have of language is represented in the brain and put to use. Okay, and this is why it's unconscious. And these are in this classification system that I'll tell you something about in a minute. These functions are called special mental functions. Language production means encoding meaning linguistically, and language comprehension is the opposite. Okay? Understanding spoken language allows you to reverse this process, decode a speaker's speech, and construct a meaning. Right? So the little drawing here shows a speech bubble and a comprehension bubble. And language is also distinct from speech. Okay, so English has two words, one for language, one for speech. How would you translate language and speech into Italian and your other languages? So language, what's the word for linguaggio in this sense? Mm-hmm. And speech? Oralità o yes. O eloquio anche. La parte più fisica, quindi okay. So language is the more abstract, combinatorial. So you can have language without any overt production. Speech, in this case, speech refers to spoken articulation, but you could have sign, right, to be the expression of signed language. Okay, so the overt. So here you make a distinction between language, speech, thought, and communication. They obviously are related, but they overlap, but they're also distinct. So you can communicate without language. You can have thought without language. You can have language without speaking. Okay, so in ordinary circumstances, we do use language to convey thoughts through speech. However, there's reasons to believe that it is a special system that functions independently of speech, writing, thought, and communication. And here I allude to this International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, which is a classification system that allows us to describe every aspect of human behavior, so memory functions, language functions, and so on. And I have used this system because I worked a lot in speech therapy. So my former position, not in Venice, but in New York, I taught to speech therapists, so linguistics for speech therapists, speech and language therapists. And there the issue is you're working with people who have potentially language impairments. Okay, it sort of overlaps with interpreters because if you think about it, speakers vary in their levels of proficiency, age. There's all kinds of situations in interpreting too, where you might actually have someone who has a speech impairment, or is a child, or is somebody who maybe is aphasic, and that's the person that you are interpreting for. Okay, so it's part of like this human variation in terms of how it is that we function. And it is useful to be aware of the fact that sometimes if somebody doesn't communicate in the way that you expect them to communicate, you shouldn't make assumptions. There's nothing wrong with their mind. They may actually have something. They may be slower for something, or they might have word finding difficulties, and it's not obvious right away. So once you know what speech disorders look like, then it's a useful background to have, because it means that you adapt to the speaker, right? You give them the time that they need, and you don't make assumptions about, oh, this person is, like hard to understand. You do that. And it's the same thing with children, right? Children speak in ways that are different from adults. Okay, so it's part of that, like understanding that human language functions vary, and somebody may have a speech impediment or difficulty or a stutter, but that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong really with their language or their mind or their thinking. So I think it's also kind of a useful kind of background to have to as an interpreter, to understand, to be, let's say, non-judgmental. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, we do make assumptions about where people are from, their level of education, and all kinds of things based on how they speak. Okay, I don't know what assumptions you made about me when you first met me. You also made assumptions about accent. You make assumptions about, so all kinds of cues that we have from people, we make assumptions, okay, because that's what we do. That's also part of being human. Okay, so being aware of this variation, I think, is also important. And okay, so language production, how we turn thoughts into language, concerns all kinds of speakers, we said, right? So normal adults, children, speakers with acquired language disorders, second language speakers, and multilinguals. These same sort of psycholinguistic models, in fact, adapt well to explain all kinds of facts about production in terms of how the system, the architecture of the system. Now, the term architecture here refers to cognitive architecture. Okay, it's sort of like I said, psycholinguistics has some jargon, fancy word, cognitive architecture for language production, meaning, well, what are the units? How does the system work? Okay, so the system that allows you to produce words and sentences. And how do we study language use through the tools of psycholinguistics? We said, well, these things, these processes are invisible, they're unconscious, okay? So we can have intuitions as to what happens when we find words, but in fact, that's actually not enough, okay? Very often we're not very good at having intuitions about how it is that we speak, because it seems so automatic. You just think, what do you think? I have a thought and I just turn it into words, right? In your L1. Okay, well, maybe you have some insights into what happens when you interpret. Okay, I think it's a good idea to reflect on as you acquire these interpreting skills. And I would like you to come, write these things down and report on them. What is it that happens? Are you getting interference from your L1? At what level are you getting interference? What facilitates it? What hinders it? Because you will be acquiring a very specialized skill that very few people have, in fact, but it's not enough to be multilingual. I would have no idea on how to interpret. Like, my two languages are like, I think the feeling is, maybe that's not true, that they're very separate. So in interpreting, not only do you have to have very high proficiency in both languages, but also train something very difficult, because you typically want to keep the languages, to speak one language at a time, right, and keep them separate. How many are you multilingual and a sort of on a daily basis in your daily life? Yeah? At home, you speak multiple languages?
I'm bilingual since I'm born.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what are your languages?
Italian and Polish.
Italian and Polish. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, right now I'm using here Italian.
Yes.
But on a daily basis, I'm talking with my parents, with my colleagues back to in Poland.
In Poland,
Polish.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I work also in French on my daily basis. So I have those 3 languages every single day. Yeah.
And do you, okay, but anybody else? Anybody else? Yeah?
I'm Spanish.
Yes.
Here I'm using Italian all the time. My husbands are Italian.
Right.
So I speak Spanish with my parents and all that by phone. But last year, for example, no, like a month ago, I'm coming from Dublin. I've been living there for a year. So I used to have also English.
English. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Cool. Anybody else? Well, you're all using the languages you're studying here, right? So, I mean, I meant in your daily lives, you're doing, well, English, lots of courses in English. And most of your courses, no, you have courses in English and Italian.
Yeah.
And other languages that you're studying, interpreting? No.
We only have English and Italian.
English and Italian, okay, just to know what languages we have in here. Okay, I mean, in
every of
profession.
us have a different language, and we will have to like study them like more privately, but more with different courses.
Right, okay. But you sort of, on your daily basis, you're doing Italian, English, plus some of you another language.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's quite a lot of exposure and practice, right? And so you're sort of, in fact, kind of multilingual, you know, on a daily basis. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so there's different ways to do research. Okay, so some of you might have actually done some corpus work or observed work on discourse analysis. Okay, so this falls under the realm of naturalistic inquiry, which means we observe behavior as it happens. We go out there and we, naturalistic is an important word because it means that you're not setting up experimental situations. You record how people mediate, do conversation, etc. Right? So you can do all kinds of analyses here. You can do corpus analysis, conversational analysis in a variety of settings. Okay, so whatever the setting is. Another interesting area that has informed how it is that production works is looking at the properties of speech errors. And we'll see a little bit more about this next week. Then another type of approach is to set up experimental situations. And this is typical of psycholinguistics. And here you actually have some hypothesis that some variable like cognitive load or something has an effect. Then you choose some very limited number of variables or conditions that you can observe this behavior in. And then you come up with what's called a quantitative design. And some of the papers in the reading list, in fact, most of them, I should say, adopt this approach, okay? So one is not better than the other. They complement one another, okay? One gives you very tight control in understanding what the effect of one variable is on the other. The other one is, well, this is ecological validity and experimental control. Like shoes, you can't have completely practical shoes that look really cool. Well, maybe you can't. You actually can't, right? It doesn't work that way. So you need 2 pairs of shoes, at least. So one operation we talked about that is important for production is the fact that even if under normal circumstances when we speak in our L1 and we're not an impaired speaker and blah blah, and we know what we know what we're talking about, language production happens fast. It's skilled and accurate. Most speakers, I mean, people don't have to go to school to learn how to speak. Okay, we just in any culture, in any society, people develop, if they have input, they're not deprived of linguistic input, they develop either a spoken language or a sign language, right? And this is different from literacy, which is learning how to read and to write is an acquired skill. But speaking in this sense, speaking or signing is biological for humans. You develop speaking and signing if you're given the right input. And so then you become very skilled, fast, and accurate. However, you're actually doing cognitive operations, and here I see the jargon that I'm throwing in. From a cognitive point of view, you're actually, in fact, and we'll demonstrate this, selecting and retrieving words from the mental store, your own mental store of words, called the mental lexicon. Okay, so you have an idea, but there's multiple ways of expressing that idea. That means that you activate potential candidates, and then you have to select one out of a competitive process. All these other candidates are like potentially good, and then you actually have to go and, in fact, retrieve that word. But speaking and studies that have looked at the speed of speech, so normal fluent speech in adults is up to 2 to 3 words per second. And even native speakers sometimes make errors. We'll talk about errors and why they're interesting. Roughly 1.5 sound error every 10,000 words. And what we mean by a sound error, here's an example. An English speaker might say park instead of car park. Okay, so what has happened here? So I wanted to go and to I wanted to go to the park, and maybe I correct myself. I say car park. What happened? For those of you who took linguistics, or maybe park instead of car park. If you were to describe what happened there, just descriptively, not why, but just what happened.
It seems like dyslexic.
Yeah, but that's no judgment. Just describe linguistically what happened, what switched. The first consonant, the first 2 sounds switched. Okay, that's what happened. That actually happens. It happens. Why? Well, you can think of it. Speaking involves planning ahead. And in fact, we'll see production studies have to do a lot with how much ahead are people actually planning when they speak. Okay, that's kind of the question. How far ahead? And errors like this show you that you've already kind of planned ahead. But it's interesting, you haven't switched, you haven't said, kark par or something like that. You've actually taken the first sound, and which is a consonant. Here I'm just using regular spelling and not, these are phonemes, okay? These are actually sound units. So both words are 1 syllable, and you have in fact switched the onset, the beginning sound, and you've switched a consonant with a consonant. Now, remember yesterday we were talking about phonemes, are phonemes real or not? Now, it turns out that if you look at speech errors that people make in production, you never see consonants switching with another sound. Consonants switch with consonants. Onsets switch with onsets. And we'll look at what this tells you about how far we plan and what kinds of units we plan when we speak. Okay?
Sorry, I didn't catch what will not change.
Oh, so to have, for example, something like car arc, or something where you've switched, or, sorry, you wouldn't switch the k with the, say, with the r. You don't switch the consonant with a vowel in an error.
And in all languages, or just in a study, for example, English?
All right.
I'm asking just,
Yes,
just
yes,
to make
yes,
a
yes,
point,
yes.
because in Polish, for example,
Yes.
I have a resonance in this. We have a lot of words that are without any. For example, we have.
That's a super interesting question.
And it's just one e inside of the word. So sometimes when I speak, and sometimes in the evening, I'm really tired, and even when I'm typing a message, I forgot mentally. I visualized the word, but then I forgot there is an e between all those letters, and sometimes I cannot relay on what you say.
Yes,
In my
okay.
language.
So this is an important point. So some things will, so errors respect the structure of the language. Okay, so in this case, this is a phonological encoding error,
Okay.
and the constraint is it respects the what are called the phonological rules in this case of English. Okay, so the constraint here is that onsets switch with onsets. So the constraint is it depends on what can occur in that position.
Okay.
It's basically saying you've planned something where you have to fill in the slots. So it's kind of imagine like a little, you have to produce three things. So the structure is let's say the syllable of the first, so you've got syllables that are little frames. They're waiting for you to put something in it. And because speaking, in fact, involves ultimately doing this, you've got this frame and then you have to put the right thing in the right slot. Okay?
Yes.
It's possible, and I don't know Polish. I don't know what the phonological constraints of Polish are, but the next time you produce a speech error, and in Polish, write it down, and I'll tell you all how to do this, because it's interesting to understand what we do, because it's a little experiment. A speech error is sort of like a little experiment in nature. It's like watching your mind, do something, and once you know how to understand speech errors, it gives you insight on how the system works. So they're kind of fun to analyze. Okay, because they're little experiments in nature. And in fact, speech errors were the first sources of data to help people understand how it is that language production worked. So in fact, people collected speech errors. There were a whole bunch of psycholinguists and linguists who would just, when you're sitting around the table, and you produced something and made an error, you wrote down what it is that you intended to say, because after all, you know what you intend to say, or the other person knows what they intended to say, and then writes down the error. Okay, so these speech error corpora exist for English and for many other languages. And quite a few of these error corpora are actually available online. So there's one famous corpus called the Frumkin corpus. Victoria Frumkin was an applied linguist who was interested in understanding how speech production worked. And Merrill Garrett, they were two. Merrill Garrett is still alive. Victoria Frumkin died a few years ago, but they made these corpora available online, and a lot of the examples that you find in the Warren book actually come from these speech error corpora. And as I said, you can collect your own corpus, and errors tell us something about how language is organized in the mind. It tells us about what the building blocks are, what the constraints are, and also about how language production works. Now, here are examples. Errors also tell you something about how far you plan when you're speaking. How far do humans plan when they speak? Okay, so this is relevant to interpreters. How far can you actually plan? Now, it turns out that errors seem to, not seem to, but occur, errors are constrained. They are not random. It's not just like something happens and you randomly produce like something unintelligible. They're very constrained. So there are errors that are sound level errors, like the car park one. So they involve the phonological encoding stage. Okay, so when you have the words, maybe two words ready, and you happen to then either switch the onsets or do something like you switch, you say, for example, clear, you wanted to say clear blue sky, but you actually end up producing clear blue sky. What happened here? Onset switched with onset, right? And then here you also have, not only that, but you also, so the first one was, actually here, yes, you've switched,
But it's like that they are like
voicing, the voicing feature, yes. Because here, the first one, so it was clear blue sky, but you've actually not, I mean, the ultimate thing you produce is a different consonant, but what has switched is the feature, the voicing feature. Okay, so you've anticipated, you've switched the voicing feature. That's what's happened. Okay, so k is, how many of you have done phonetics, phonology?
Yeah, this is occlusives.
You've all done phonetics and phonology?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So voicing, so g, k. Okay, so when the vocal folds start to vibrate, that tells you whether something's voiced or not. And that, as you're saying, voicing is a feature. Okay, so the difference between g and k, they're produced in the same way in terms of where they're produced. They're both consonants. The only thing they differ or distinct that distinguishes them is voicing. That's why it's called a distinctive feature. So if you voice k, what sound does it become? Instead of saying k, you say, what if I just change voicing?
It's G.
G. We're doing the sounds, okay? We have to do sounds. K becomes g. And if I take away voicing from ba, it becomes p. Okay? So that's what happened here. So it's the voicing feature switched. Okay? So it's a featural error, meaning that's what switched. Then you can have phonemes, okay? So here, in this case, the vowel switched with a vowel. Instead of saying ad hoc, the person said, these are real errors, okay? They're not made up. Somebody said them and wrote them down. Mm-hmm.
No, so it was just about the voicing. So voicing voice consonants is like sordo, sonoro.
Yes, sordo e sonoro, esatto,
Okay.
esatto. Sordo e sonoro in Italian.
And voice plosives.
Exactly, yes. So in fact, very good. These are voiced, these are plosives, meaning that they are consonants produced with an interruption to the airflow, complete closure of the airflow. In fact, they're called occlusives or stops. That's another term. And one's the voiced one, one's the unvoiced one. Yes, exactly. We can do a little review of phonetics and phonology. And here, what happened was the vowels switched. Instead of saying ad hoc, the person said odd hack. Okay? You can also, but these are all sound level units. Okay? They're not whole words. They're parts of words, and they are, in fact, either single phonemes or clusters of phonemes, like the onset of a syllable. So spoon feeding, spoon speeding. Okay, this was somebody who said, oh, no more boom, speeding. Okay, what happened? You switched the onset again. Um, so these types of errors occur between words that are very close. Linguistically, they're in the same constituent. Okay, they're in the same phrase. Okay, they're not at the beginning of the sentence and one at the end. So these sound unit items errors occur in a very local uh, domain, okay, reflecting the moment when we are actually doing articulatory encoding. You've gone from thinking something to finding the words to coming up with the right sentence structure, and then you are actually planning in your head, obviously this isn't conscious, the output. Then you do articulatory encoding. And why do errors happen? Well, errors happen because we're doing this fast. We have to retrieve all of this different units, meaning units, word level units, sound units, and ultimately in production, assemble them and linearize them and produce them in time. Because that's an essential part of speaking is, in fact, you're producing sequences. It's kind of motor sequential behavior, okay? And you typically plan a little bit ahead. So you're holding these units, you're getting them ready to produce, and this is the output. So sometimes this fast mechanism actually goes wrong. Okay, so when would you make more errors? Well, obviously, the faster you're talking, the harder the cognitive load, etc. Right? Tiredness. We talked yesterday about, do you make more errors when you're drunk? Yes, probably. And when you're tired, and so on. Yes. Okay? But these errors are really interesting because they tell us something, or the question yesterday, are phonemes real? Well, yes, because in fact, they switch around. Your mind still obeys structure, okay? So this is sort of indirect evidence that these units are in fact real in language use, okay? So if you look at errors from this point of view, they're actually really interesting. You can also have errors, again, these morphological errors are pretty frequent. And this tells you something often about semantic and form relationships in the lexicon. So we tend to organize our words in terms of meaning relationships, obviously, because we use language to convey meaning, but words that are related in meaning often are related in form. And so one common error is actually producing a word with the opposite meaning. Okay, so antonyms or things that mean opposites. Okay, because they are sometimes happy, sad. They've got a meaning relationship, even if they mean the opposite of one another. But also words that, for example, sure and unsure, they mean the opposite. Okay, but they are also morphologically related. So in this case, the adjective sure and the adjective unsure are, the unsure is morphologically derived from sure, okay? And interestingly, this so speakers make speech errors, and sometimes the ones where you say something, but you meant the opposite, cause trouble, right? So you wanted to say, oh, she's really nice, and you say something not nice, okay? So those kind of speech errors were of great interest to Freud, Sigmund Freud. I don't know if you've heard about Freudian errors and so on. And so there's a whole psycholinguistic explanation of errors that basically says, well, errors happen because that's the way our language system works, not so much our thinking system. Okay, but again, when I said we tend to judge people, and for example, think of current president of the United States, Biden, or any era, in fact, any prominent political figure who makes speech errors, they're very visible. Then they get analyzed and so on. But some of the ones that Biden made a few months ago, in fact, do not reflect his cognitive status, but they are benign psycholinguistic errors, right? So he said, instead of saying the name of one president, he said somebody else. They have a psycholinguistic explanation, okay? Now, that's not to say that if you're older, that you wouldn't make more of them, but the types of errors that he made in those speeches are not nothing, you know, weird. So I hereby deputize you, I hereby jeopardize you. Okay, so here you've got a word exchange, and instead of saying deputize, you say jeopardize, which means something very, very different. And what you notice, so this is kind of word exchange, there's also phonological similarity. This is called a spoonerism, a sort of a spoonerism where you have one word substitute for another word and they're phonologically related. So then you can also have errors that happen at a different planning stage. And these involve substituting phrases. Okay, so instead of saying the sun is shining, the person says, so the person wanted to say the sun is shining, the sky is blue. But in this case, the error, what the person actually ended up saying was the sky is shining. Okay, what happened here? If somebody said the sky is shining, what do you think happened?
It's nonsense. Like
It sounds like nonsense. Well, it is, but the person again, you've got you've got your pre-linguistic. You want to say something. You probably activate more than one thing you want to say, and you end up blending the two. Okay, so at the message level here, you've got activation of more than one message, and you end up blending them. And so sometimes what you end up saying is nonsensical, but that's not because your thinking was nonsensical. It's the bottleneck of your language production system in a way. Okay? So, yeah.
I have a question. Is it because our brain is oriented to short thing? For example, when I see those two phrases and I see the error, well, I see the sky is shining, as in mean the sign in the sky is shining. So it's a short version.
Yes. But in this case, the person really wanted to say, so the person who wrote down the error
Okay.
knew that she wanted to say the sun is shining, the sky is blue, but ended
Okay.
up saying
Okay.
this. Okay, so it wasn't deliberate. These are errors. So these are unintentional deviations from what you know you were going to say. These are unintentional deviations, these kinds of errors. Okay?
Okay.
So it's not deliberate. Again, it's unconscious, unintentional deviation from what you actually were going to say or planning to say. So write down your errors, okay? We'll say more about errors next week because the book chapter goes into all kinds of errors. So write down any error you make, either in Polish, Italian, English, or if you find yourself producing a bilingual error. Like bilingual errors are interesting because I still remember one bilingual error I made many years ago now when I was still living in New York, and I thought that was a really cool error. And I was actually, I'd been living in New York for a few years. I wasn't speaking Italian. I didn't know any Italians. And I walked past an Italian restaurant that had, it was, ivy, like fake ivy, fake edera, fake ivy. And I walked past, and it was kind of funny, and I said, oh, look, heather. And I said, heather in English. And I thought, okay, that must have come from Italian. Because ivy and heather, they're both plants. Okay, so semantically, that was actually, to me, my explanation was that was a mixed bilingual error. So I explained that error, but then at the time, I was still in touch with Gary Dell, and I emailed him, and I said, oh, this error is so cool, because this is, bilingual mixed error. Well, I'll tell you more about mixed errors are the ones that are both semantic and phonological, like saying rat when you meant cat. Okay, so they tell us something about how the system works. we'll get to that. But in that case, my explanation, let's see if you can explain why. So Heather is Erika in right? Heather is a different, so it's completely different from Ivy. But why would I say Heather instead of Ivy when I meant to say Ivy?
Maybe because you associated with the Italian restaurant and you.
But it was unconscious, right? But and I was not aware of my Italian because I wasn't speaking. I was walking down the street. I was talking to somebody in English, and I said, "Look, Heather," and then so it was unconscious. It means to me, my explanation is that the plant or that Italian restaurant activated unconsciously. It activated edera, and edera is similar to Heather phonologically. So the shows that those you've got the semantic activation that feeds into like in this case it was the plant lexicon in both languages, and that edera received some unconscious activation, and that was kind of transmitted to Heather because of the phonological similarity. So none of that was conscious. I didn't, but that's the only explanation that I could have. And this notion of things receiving some activation, but you don't necessarily then select them. Remember when I said when we speak, we have to select and retrieve the words. What are we selecting them from? Candidates that could be potentially good things to say, but then you end up not giving them. We'll understand activation, and this is where those computational models come in handy. Okay, so the neural network models that rely on this notion of activation, that you have some level of activation, but one thing then gets chosen, and that's what you end up saying. Okay, so these cognitive models or neural network models of what happens in the mind are also useful to understand the behavior. So in this case, to understand, right, why would you say, Heather when you meant Ivy? And so this is to invite you to also, next time you say something that you didn't intend to say, to write it down, and maybe it's an interesting one. So common ones are the sound ones. Why? Because we speak fast and we're doing this planning kind of, and it's easy to anticipate or perseverate in your sounds. Okay? And other ones are kind of like syntax ones are also interesting when you switch, instead of saying verb, you say another verb, or when you say something and you instead of saying, I don't know, the cat was chased by the mouse, you say the mouse was chased by the cat, like a whole syntax error like that when you actually, but the important thing is that they respect different stages of planning, okay? So the phonological ones are more local, and they respect the phonological planning stage. And the ones that have to do more with switching words with words that are more at a distance, that has to do with a different planning stage, and we'll talk about those planning stages. So that's to say, errors gave us some initial evidence as to how speaking actually happens, going from thinking to speaking, but then very, very successful 50 years of research, doing experiments, again, which allow you to control. And here control means that you set up conditions where there's a minimal difference between what you're looking at. So that you, for example, if you want to know, we'll give an example, whether semantics matters in terms of how we organize our mental lexicon, then you can set up a study where you look at whether words overlap semantically versus don't overlap semantically, and you look for a consequence in behavior. Okay, so that means again you have so that any difference you observe, actually then you can impute to that change that you made. Okay, and this applies broadly. Okay, so it applies if you're teaching, if you're doing a clinical intervention, if you want to know how, whatever. It's a very broad methodological approach. And in studies that adopt this type of So we're on till 3. That correct? Yes. So we got 13 more minutes. We have 2 types of variables, and you'll see these in the papers we read. Okay, so if this is new to you, just be patient. If it's old, tell me it's old. Okay, so they are called independent and dependent variables. So what are independent and dependent variables? So the dependent variable is the behavior that you observe. For example, how fast you are at responding, how accurate you are at producing. Okay, for example. So that's what you measure. You're like, I want to know how fast you are or how accurate you are. That's called the dependent variable, what you observe. So speed and accuracy are very common ones in this kind of approach. Okay, speed and accuracy. So for example, when you did your entrance test to the program, you were given a task, right? And then you were assessed on your accuracy in understanding something. Okay, that was the dependent variable. Okay, if you use this type of language. So you can look at errors, number of correct responses, and how fast, reaction times. And typically experimental studies, just because things are very complex and language is very complex, they tend to concentrate on one measure at a time. Okay, so they tend to report on one measure, like do the statistics reporting one dependent variable at a time. And we'll understand why this is. What you do in studies that adopt this kind of approach, sort of experimental approach, you vary, and the technical term is manipulate, not in a bad manipulate here, because manipulate is not, it's not a nice word, but in this context, manipulate means to change. You vary or manipulate the situations under which the behavior is observed and measured. And this is called the independent variable. And in many studies, in the papers we read, you actually have more than one of these independent variables. So independent variables are the conditions that you set up to study your behavior. You want to know how accurate people are at recognizing speech in noise. Your independent variable would be the level of noise, for example. And your dependent variable would be, say, accuracy, reaction time, and so on. Okay? And in these kinds of studies, you have participants, people who come in very often because we need to measure these behaviors. A lot of what we know about how people speak, comprehend, and produce language comes from studies where you do things at the computer. Why? Because it's easy to record what you present and store, for example, reaction times and present audio, visual, and so on. So you can do things where you set up what people see, hear, and do, and then you have ways to measure. For example, you have microphones that actually measure speech onset time, like when you start speaking, how long it takes you to start speaking, and you can record that, and you can have a measure of, for example, speech onset time, okay, as a reaction time measure. Okay, and so a lot of the software that allows you to do this automatically records all of these data, and then you can analyze them, right? And for other tasks in language production, so some of them are automatically coded, but when you look at what people say, very often you have to end up transcribing what they say. Okay, so lots of language production tasks involve transcription, and then you classify responses. So I spent a good part of my life transcribing what people say, from children to adults to phasics. Okay, so my life transcribing. And now that we have automatic speech recognition, life is a lot easier. But then you classify responses. Okay, so you transcribe and you classify, and you turn those into the things that you want to look at. So this would be, and then you can have all kinds of tasks. Okay, so here's a person sitting at a computer. One task you can also look at to ask questions about the lexicon is called a lexical decision task. Okay, so what is lexical decision? You're shown strings of words and potential words. For example, you see a word on the screen and you have to say as quickly as by pressing a button whether this is a word or not. Okay, so is this in fact a real word or non-word? And there's some really interesting twists on these kinds of tasks. You can also use this kind of task to study whether people have racial biases or stereotypes or gender stereotypes. There's all kinds of ways that you can, even something like I can tell you more about this kind of application of lexical decision, right? So you ask people to decide as quickly as possible if a word is a word or not, and then by combining the non-words with the real words, you can measure what the effect of having a previous word is on how fast you're responding to another word. Okay, so you can use it for all kinds of reasons, and it's easy to collect reaction times. Okay, so you measure reaction times, and what do you vary or manipulate? Well, it depends on your question, what you want, what you're interested in. Okay, so a wug. Is wug a word or not?
No.
Nope. But is it a word or not? Yes.
No.
No. Okay, but wug is a possible word, okay, for English. It respects the phonological properties of English. Beetle is an existing word, and cumug is an impossible word of English, okay, because it violates the phonotactic properties, the combinations of sounds in English. Okay, so, and you can show that people are sensitive to this, okay, to these kinds of variables. Another task that you use to look at speaking, again, for speaking, the challenge is that you want to get people to say what you're interested in, but how do you do that, right? You have to give them something pre-linguistic. Okay, so one technique that has been used a lot is to ask people to name things or to describe things. So you give them pictures or little sketches. And the reason is because you want to make sure that they come up with a pre-verbal concept that's similar, and then you're interested in how it is that this then gets turned into language. Okay, so naming a picture or describing an action is commonly used in language production research. What's this? A cat, a kitten, right? Okay, so how long did it take you to come up and say this?
Immediately. Immediately.
Not
A few
immediately.
seconds.
Not less than a second. Does anybody remember what I said yesterday?
It was
How-
like
600, very good. 600 milliseconds, right? 600 milliseconds. That's a long time. Okay, so it's not immediate. It's not seconds, it's not immediate. And interestingly, you're doing separate things in those 600 milliseconds. Okay, so you say cat, and how do we know what you did? Okay, you use a technique called priming. So in lexical priming, you present people with words that can either be phonologically, semantically, or a combination, phonological plus semantic, prior to the picture. And then you measure how fast the person is at actually producing that word. Okay, so you're using this priming technique. Okay, and this priming has been used a lot in psycholinguistics, both in production and comprehension. And it can be used to answer all kinds of questions, not just about, use or processing, like the timing of mental operations, but also about what those mental representations are, what primes what. So I'm just going to skip to the actual example because this is a little bit too much text right now and we'll come back to it. Okay, so I'm just skipping. So remember the question in the Warren book on page 4, there was a whole list of like kinds of questions that we want to ask about how humans organize language in their heads, and the question about words or the mental lexicon. Do we organize words semantically, phonologically, or both? So is cat stored close to dog, or rat, or both, or neither? Okay, so how would I use priming to answer that question? Well, a psycholinguist would do this. A psycholinguist would come up with a little study, would design a priming study where people are asked to name pictures of objects, and we measure how quickly. That's the dependent measure, how quickly. Okay, that's called a latency. And in this case, you can either do it right with a microphone that actually records speech onset time. So how does the reaction time or speech onset time, RT is short for reaction time. You see this commonly used. How does time depend on the characteristics of the prime word, of what you just heard? Okay, now this is just one example trial, but you would do this with lots and lots of pictures and lots of trials, then you average and so on. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is the idea, just to give you an idea of how you would do this. So your experimental study has a design where you say, I want to know if speech onset time changes depending on the previous word the characteristics of the word you've heard right before on the previous trial. And I want to look at 3 types of relationships: phonological, semantic, and both. You could do more and so on, right? This is where you choose those situations that you measure your dependent variable with. So the independent variable in this case is the type of word, prime type, and it has 3 possible conditions. Okay, one where it's semantic, and this we'll call level 1. One where the relationship is unrelated, like a word like boat, we'll call this level 2. And then phonological plus semantic. Okay, so if your target picture in this case is cat, okay, then a suitable prime for the semantically related would be dog, for the unrelated would be boat, and for something that's both phonological and semantic would be rat. My question now is, are you faster at naming cat when you've just seen something or heard a word or read a word that's semantically related compared to one that's unrelated? Okay, and are you even faster at naming the picture if you compared to a word that also is phonologically and semantically related? What do you think? So semantically related, I read dog, and then the next trial I see cat. In the unrelated condition, I would see something like boat, and then I'm given the picture of the cat to name. And in the condition where I have phonologically related, I might see, rat, phonologically plus semantically. Sorry, I have to fix this. I thought I'd fix it. Name the picture. Predictions. What do you think? Are you faster at naming cat after you've read dog?
Yeah.
Yes, semantically. It's actually, let's say yes, it's actually true. You are faster. Right? If you're faster at saying doctor if you've just processed nurse. Okay? So that's primed, meaning that you've activated that word and the words that are semantically similar. It doesn't stay there forever. That's a transient activation. Okay? But yes. Okay, so naming times to visually presented pictures are longer when the preceding word is semantically unrelated. Okay, so on average, unrelated, followed by semantic, followed by semantic plus phonological. So your reaction times are shorter when you've got both a prime that's phonological and semantic. Okay, and so that's just a baby example of how you would go about answering these questions with a little experiment. Now, other studies that have looked at what happens in those 600 milliseconds from recognizing something to saying the word, just a single word in isolation, this is what happens. Those 600 milliseconds are divided into separate operations that it turns out we do in our heads. We have to recognize what the concept is. You're going from an image to recognizing that that's meow, something that meows. Then you have to find the word in the language. Okay, so if it's Polish, if it's English, and so on, that's called lemma retrieval, the actual word in that language that expresses that concept. Then you do the phonological encoding. And then you do the syllabification and phonetic encoding. And things can go wrong at these levels, those errors. Phonological errors can happen here, but you've already done the lemma axis. You can also choose the wrong lemma. You can choose the lemma of a competing word. For example, if dog happens to receive too much activation for whatever reasons, you might say dog instead of cat. Okay, so this way of sort of approaching like what happens in your mind involves sort of various inferences as to what the stages are and also what errors can occur. Okay, so the time course means the time it takes to say a word. And I will see you next week on, let me tell you what we're going to do next week. We'll just finish these slides, and if you want to read ahead, Warren, chapter 2 and 3 we're going to cover. Okay, it's kind of a lot, 2 and 3. It's production next week. We'll do chapter 2 on Tuesday, chapter 3 on Wednesday. Okay?
So here in class.
So we'll do it in class. Yeah, we'll go over, and then so you can read it at home if you want to, if you have time to, but we'll go over in class.
I have a question
Mm-hmm.
about errors. What about, I'm listening to you.